Welcome to today's webinar discussion, everyone. We'll let everyone who is, just give a minute to let everyone join before we start our conversation with Nel Chatterjee about electricity grid, decarbonization, and market-based strategies. But thank you for joining. Welcome everybody to today's Utah Climate and Clean Air Compact event focused on market-based solutions to climate and our electricity grid with Nel Chatterjee. I'll introduce Nel in a minute, but for those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Josh Kraft, and I am the Government Relations Manager for Utah Clean Energy. Today's event is part of an ongoing series of educational briefings that are part of the Utah Climate and Clean Air Compact, which many of you are signatories of, and Utah Clean Energy is proud to help facilitate. The Climate and Clean Air Compact is a leadership initiative based in Utah focused on bringing together Utah leaders from all walks of life to have productive conversations about climate change and climate solutions here in Utah and also around the nation. And we're proud to note that this initiative has grown to over 175 leaders from business, government, faith, healthcare, and a range of other fields, both in energy and environment and from without. For those of you who aren't familiar or haven't gone to our website, I will share that, but we encourage all of you to check out the signatories at www.climateandcleanaircompact.org to learn a little bit more. A core principle of the Climate and Clean Air Compact is to look at how we can re-energize Utah and deal with a number of the challenges we're seeing and the opportunities that come with climate and the changes in the electricity grid. I think all of us today can recognize this conversation about how we can maintain and our electricity reliability in market-based ways comes at an important time. We're seeing here in Utah and across the Southwest a tremendous heat wave with record temperatures that are impacting our electricity grid, how it operates, and it's good to think through how we can address this challenge. And so I'm pleased to have both guests with us, and I'll introduce them in just a second. I do want to let everyone know a couple quick logistical notes. We are recording this event to share with some folks who may want to join us and watch later. So we encourage everyone, ask everyone to remain on mute so we can avoid background noise and focus on what our speakers and moderators are saying. We will also let everyone know that we'll have some time. We should have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of today's discussion. So we ask everyone, if you have questions, please put those in the chat. And I will, at the end, I will unmute folks so you can ask your own questions in your own words. Please be brief if you can, so we can focus on questions on our discussions. And with that, I want to introduce our panelist and our moderator. Our panelist, our main speaker today is Nel Chatterjee. Nel Chatterjee, Nel is well known and in energy and environmental and policy circles. And he currently serves as a senior advisor to the Climate Leadership Council in Washington, D.C., which focuses on market-based solutions to climate change. Prior to that, Nel was the chair and commissioner of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission under President Donald Trump from 2017 to 2020. and he was a longtime prominent advisor to Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. And I would be remiss if I did not note that Neil hosts a podcast called Plugged In with reporters from the Washington Examiner, which you should check out. It's exciting conversations. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Our moderator today, and I'm going to want to introduce him as well, Representative Steve Handy, who represents the House District 16 in Layton. He is a Climate and Clean Air Compact signatory and a longtime friend of Utah Clean Energies. He serves as the chair of the Utah Legislature's House Economic Development and Workforce Service Committee and a co-chair of the Bipartisan Clean Air Caucus. He's really delved into all things energy policy and was the lead author of Utah's unique Community Renewable Energy Act. Welcome, Representative Handy.
Thank you, Josh. Happy to be here, all of you. It's going to be fun.
Cool. Well, with that, we're going to have an exciting series, a little chat between Neil and Representative Handy. Just a reminder, put everyone on, keep yourself on mute, and Representative Handy, I'll hand things over to you.
Thanks very much. In our prep meeting, Neil, I reminded you, you don't remember me, but I do remember coming. I was on in an energy conference some time ago when you were FERC commissioner in Washington, and I was at an energy conference, and we wandered over to FERC for the afternoon, or part of the afternoon, and I wanted to ask a question, and I asked you a question about, because we have this fairly controversial project in Utah called the Lake Powell pipeline, and I knew that there was a pending FERC ruling coming, and I remember you and I discussing that together, and you said in the prep meeting that you were one of the you were the dissenting vote in that. It was a 2-1, and it didn't make it, I guess, whatever. I can't remember what it was now, but anyway, it's a long process, but I do remember you, and this is going to be really fun. So Josh gave a nice part of your bio. Was there anything you'd like to add? But tell the participants this afternoon about FERC. It's kind of one of those, it's a very powerful but kind of lesser known federal regulatory agencies. Tell us about FERC.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you all for hosting me and for this opportunity. And I will note my vote on Lake Powell, I voted the pro-Utah position, and it was my dissent ever at the commission. I'd been chair and had been in the majority, and so it was unusual for the chair to dissent, but I felt my colleagues got it wrong, and I voted the pro-Utah position. But for those of you who don't follow the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, closely, it is a increasingly significant agency as it comes to the energy transition and our efforts to decarbonize. I think the work FERC does has always been significant, but increasingly legislative intransigence in Congress and inability to kind of move things forward when it comes to decarbonization at a federal level, more and more of the key decisions are falling to agencies like FERC. FERC is the nation's principal reliability regulator. What does that mean? I felt that my foremost obligation as chair, and my colleagues' obligation, was our responsibility for the oversight of the grid, and to make sure that when Americans hit the switch, the lights came on. The grid is increasingly being challenged by everything from extreme weather events to cyber attacks to physical attacks, to dealing with the complexities of the energy transition and the retirement of some resources and the integration of newer, cleaner energy resources. And so that's a critical role that FERC plays. FERC oversees the country's competitive wholesale electric markets. It has the responsibility for evaluating applications for natural gas pipelines and liquefied natural gas export facilities. It oversees hydroelectric licensing, and increasingly plays an important role in the build out of transmission. FERC sets the return on equity that is required for these huge CapEx investments, but can also provide incentives for transmission, and has recently undertaken a pretty substantial rulemaking that looks to, kind of remove some of the barriers that have prevented the build out of the necessary transmission infrastructure that we need to ensure that the grid of the future, a cleaner, more nimble, more flexible and resilient grid, that it's in place. And so FERC has tremendous responsibility. I used to joke around with former Secretary Rick Perry when he was the Secretary of Energy that I thought the Department of Energy was misnamed, that it should be really the Department of Science, because that is what DOE's principal, responsibility. And that FERC was in fact the most significant energy regulatory agency in the United States. Secretary Perry, of course, rolled his eyes in his classic Texas way at me, but FERC is in many ways one of the most significant agencies that you haven't heard of. And again, it was an honor for me to serve there as both the commissioner and chair, and that it gave me a front row seat to the energy transition.
Terrific, Neil. That is really wonderful. And I've had just a little bit of an exposure to FERC and know a little bit about it, but that was very, very helpful. Josh knows, and some of the others on the call, that I've been very interested in advancing a conversation in Utah about regional transmission organizations, but that's not the topic that we're going to go to today. So the question I want to ask you this is this is how I remembered you, that you'd worked for Senator McConnell. So you're a conservative, and so let's get into really the nub of what our conversation is supposed to be this afternoon, and that is that how have you come to see, and maybe you've evolved into this like I have a little bit, that climate change is a central challenge that policymakers need to address, and let's talk about that, what you see in the national and on the state level, how that's advancing or not advancing.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Look, I'm a Republican from Kentucky who worked for Senator McConnell and was appointed chairman of FERC by Donald Trump. I made from the moment I took my seat at FERC and had a platform of my own that I believe that climate change was real, that man had a significant impact, that we urgently needed to take steps to decarbonize, but that I was not in favor of overreaching regulations that were legally dubious or subsidies or mandates, and that I really favored a market approach to carbon mitigation. And what I came to recognize, unfortunately, is that like everything else in Washington and around the U.S. in our political discourse these days, is energy and environmental issues have become as polarized as all of the other hot button issues. And that wasn't always the case. When I first came to Washington in the early 2000s, energy issues were technical and wonky. Out in your all's neighborhood, the Senate was run by two senators, one Republican, one Democrat, both from New Mexico. And these two senators, Domenici and Bingaman, they would swap the gavel back and forth during the early 2000s because the political pendulum in the Senate was swinging back and forth. And yet the agenda of the committee never changed because they were voting for their state. They were voting for New Mexico. They were voting for their region, and it wasn't political. And you found that Democrats and Republicans in the West had much more in common with each other than, say, Republicans in the West and Republicans in the Northeast or Republicans in the Southeast. And energy was really regional and parochial and not political. It's interesting to think now that you had John McCain as the Republican nominee for president in 2008. He was the primary author of a cap and trade bill to curb carbon emissions. You had Senator Romney was the Republican nominee for president of the United States in 2012. And as you all know better than anybody, has really been a leader in this space. And so climate change and carbon mitigation wasn't always political, but it has sadly become polarized and political over the last decade or so, which has made solutions that much more difficult to come by. And so what I saw during my time at FERC was that, we needed to find a constructive way forward. So I mentioned earlier, and you mentioned, and I actually, I do think a conversation around RTOs and market expansion is relevant to this discussion, because I think markets have played a tremendous role in not just delivering for consumers and the economy, for reliability, but also for the environment. We have been squeezing carbon out of the U.S. power sector, and I think that's largely been driven by market forces. When you think back, the cap and trade legislation that I mentioned that Senator McCain and others had authored never moved forward in Congress. the EPA Clean Power Plan, which was the basis for the West Virginia versus EPA ruling that came out a couple of weeks ago, it was actually stayed by the Supreme Court and withdrawn and never went into effect. President Trump famously pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and yet power sector carbon dioxide emissions continue to decrease in the face of this political intransigence, because there were some interesting things that came about, and I really feel that it's worth spending a minute to talk about it. One is the role that markets played, and I think markets have played a critical role, and I'd love to see markets expanded into the West and throughout the U.S. That probably is a conversation for another day, but I wanted to put a flag in there. Two, the business case for clean energy has really, really improved, and there's no question at their onset, some of the renewable resources were really propped up by subsidies and mandates and regulations. That is no longer the case. There's a genuine business case to be made for clean energy. And you couple that with consumer demand to where everyone from Fortune 50 companies to small mom and pop businesses to individual households, as people become more aware of their energy consumption, their carbon footprint, people are clamoring for and demanding cleaner sources of energy. And so that puts us in a real moment where the reality of political intransigence at the federal level is bumping up against the fact that Americans want to do something about the environment and climate change. And we just have to find a smarter path forward.
Neil, that is just amazing information that you're sharing and an amazing perspective, and you're providing some fertile ground here for the Q&A as we advance to that in a few more minutes. The next topic, as we keep that in mind, the foundation of our conversation that I want you to maybe address a little bit, is this. There's a new report out called Achieving Grid Reliability and Decarbonization Through Carbon Pricing. Tell us about that report, your perspective on that, and what we ought to think about it and learn about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a report I was proud to co-author with Greg Bertelsen, the CEO of the Climate Leadership Council. And I think it's worth, before I get into the report, giving you a little bit of background on how I arrived at carbon pricing as a solution. So I mentioned FERC's role in overseeing markets. What was effectively happening was that in the absence of any kind of federal legislative guidance on carbon mitigation, states were taking it upon themselves to pursue policies that they felt benefited their own decarbonization goals. And that's fine. I'm a big believer in states' rights, and I absolutely believe that states have the right to make decisions about their resource mix and resource adequacy and their own energy future. The problem is when you have a multi-state market, what we were finding is scenarios in which state A would pursue policies at the state level that favored their resources, and that actually inhibited state D's resources from being dispatched and compensated, and state D may not have necessarily shared state A's public policy objectives. And in this, I and my colleagues at FERC found that to be unjust and unreasonable, and that it was prudent for the federal regulator to step in. And we pursued a policy called a minimum offer price rule, which I don't want to bore people in the weeds. It very simply was, you have to bid in your true cost in a competitive market. You can't bid in your subsidized cost. I didn't think this was a particularly controversial thing. I thought it would sort of streamline markets and send efficient signals. But the states, which were in the state legislatures and representative, you can obviously understand this, they were upset. They didn't like the idea of the federal regulator coming in and undermining what they were trying to do. And so certain states threatened to drop out of the markets that FERC oversaw. And so I found myself in this conundrum in which I wanted markets to succeed and move forward, but and work efficiently, but I didn't want these states to drop out because that would lead to the demise of the market, and I thought that would be unfortunate. And so I tried to find, a reasonable path forward. And in my view, it just crystallized a price on carbon it's transparent, it's market-based, it eliminates the need for these, competing state interests, and enables everyone to move towards their stated decarbonization goals in a market-based and transparent way. And I felt very strongly about that. It was upon leaving the commission and working with the Climate Leadership Council that I also started to zero in on questions around electric reliability. In our focus on decarbonization, which has been necessary, and I'm very glad we have been doing that, in some ways we've taken our eyes off of reliability as an issue. And what's happening is some of these states are pursuing objectives like shutting down certain forms of generation, not because their engineers or their market, resource adequacy plans tell them to do so, but because of political reasons. They want to take fossil plants offline. And I understand that. But when you do it in that way, and in some instances, you're retiring certain necessary forms of generation before their balancing resources, before their replacements are ready. And that leads to electricity shortfalls and dangerous threats to reliability. We're seeing it right now. In Texas this week, Texas has twice been on the brink of, potentially rolling blackouts and brownouts. They've had to curtail power. They've had to ask consumers to really conserve, to get through some of these extreme peaks. They're going through a very, very hot summer. And that's because their resource mix, has been governed by political actors and not by engineers. And so what I found was, in looking at this complex dynamic, a price on carbon isn't just the most effective market-based solution to drive down emissions, it's the reliability solution as well. And that's really, I encourage everybody to download the paper. It's not a super long read, but it really delves into these complicated issues that lay out that when compared to other tools to decarbonize, carbon pricing isn't just the economically viable model, it's the reliability model.
That is just music to my ears. We talk in the Utah legislature a lot about this issue of reliability. It's a huge concern for us, a growing state, a booming economy. We have challenges, as you might know, as a federal land state, 66% by the federal government. Lots of efforts. I mean, it's almost impossible to build transmission lines. The costs are just unbelievable. No one can do it, and it's a huge concern for us. So I really love what you're talking about, and that's really where I am too in policy in terms of market-based solutions. Let's go back a little bit and talk maybe a little bit about the electric system, where you see, kind of put on your Swami hat or whatever, and let's look out there 20 to 30 years as we look to decarbonize, but also improve resiliency and flexibility in our electricity grid. The grid is just this huge conversation, and so critical, and there aren't enough policymakers who really understand it well enough. But what insights can you share there, Neil?
Look, it's be looking at the energy policy landscape, the energy landscape, but it's a complicated one, and we've got to get policy right at the federal level, at the state level over the next decade or so to ensure that we can make this transition. And there's some really exciting things happening. Two things that I'm really proud of that I worked on that are kind of part of my legacy at FERC, I think are examples of conservative approaches to the clean energy transition. So I passed two rules during my time at FERC. One, to remove barriers to entry to batteries and battery storage technology. The other was to remove barriers to entry to aggregated distributed energy resources. These are behind the meter resources like rooftop solar, advanced appliances, electric vehicles. And the idea was that these technologies had attributes that they could contribute for capacity, for energy, for ancillary services, but the existing market rules prevented them from being compensated for all of the value that they could bring to the grid. And so rather than mandating it or regulating it, what my colleagues and I simply did was enable them to compete and to be compensated. And my view is that once those resources are able to compete and be compensated, they will be deployed in an accelerated fashion. And that will drive innovation, which will further drive down carbon emissions, particularly the rule FERC Order 2222 dealing with aggregated distributed energy resources. Think here, electric vehicles. If you have a single electric vehicle, you can't possibly impact a power market or the grid. But if through the power of technology and software and aggregation, we can harness thousands and thousands of electric vehicles and rooftop solar arrays and advanced appliances, suddenly you're competing against the power plant down the street, and you're doing so at the point of demand, which gives you a real advantage. And I think these FERC rules, a decade from now, we may look back and say they laid the groundwork to fundamentally realter the way that Americans generate, distribute, and consume power and drive down emissions. Just think if, we can take a power market rule designed to drive down power sector emissions, and in doing so, it provides yet another incentive for people to get electric vehicles. And suddenly we're accelerating the deployment of electric vehicles. This power market rule may actually have a positive benefit in driving down automotive sector emissions as well, which is our single biggest challenge in terms of decarbonizing the US economy. So, these things foretell changes in our electricity grid and electricity system. Now, we have to take threats around cybersecurity and extreme weather seriously, and make sure we get policies right. In some ways, these types of resources maybe offer greater reliability and greater resilience in the face of extreme weather. But simultaneously, because of the nature of expanding the sort of playing field of generation and distribution, you're potentially also expanding your risk to cyber vulnerabilities. So these are all complicated things. But transmission and the grid of the future, which you touched on, is going to be such an essential as well. The reality is where we have robust clean energy resources is not necessarily always where the demand centers are. And we've got to build out long haul transmission lines to get the power from where these cleaner sources of energy are to where the demand is. And this, to me, in my view, is another reason, and we could write a whole other paper about this as an addendum to the reliability paper. But I think there's a case to be made that a price on carbon would you mentioned, Representative, the challenges of the expense of building out long haul transmission. I think a price on carbon, you could make a case that it would incentivize developers to take advantage of this, to build out some of the necessary transmission that we need to get done. But it's not going to be easy. One of the things that I think it's so important to have a dialogue like this, and I appreciate everyone that has tuned in. There's huge regional differences. And I really came to appreciate this greatly during my time at FERC. Look, I'm from Kentucky. I grew up on the East Coast. I spent a lot of time in the Northeast. Energy issues, transmission issues play very differently in the Northeast than in the West. And what I came to recognize during my trips out West in my official capacity at FERC was that, Westerners value clean air. They value clean water. They value the beautiful terrain. But you guys want reliable and clean energy as well. And you want to do that with a minimal footprint that doesn't disrupt the terrain around where you all live. And so we've just got to work together and find smart, minimally invasive ways to help transition to that cleaner, more flexible, more nimble, more resilient grid of the future.
Great stuff, Neil. Thanks very much. I wanted to talk a little bit about, we are here in Utah and in the Southwest, in Mountain West, Southwest, in the midst of a multiple year, 20 plus year, maybe longer mega drought. It's hot here today. It's we are our lawns are dying, and there needs to be some brown there. It's fine. Our Great Salt Lake is famous Great Salt Lake. This amazing ecosystem is on the verge of collapse. We're doing what we can do. We need obviously more of a snowpack, but there seem to be these, and I'm watching them personally, these extreme weather events. More of them, and these. Let's talk about the converging trends of climate change and more severe weather events and rapid changes in electricity resource mix, and a move to a greater reliance on the grid from electrification, and shaping how grid operators and regulators are seeing the electricity grid. That's kind of a mouthful there, but do you sort of begin to touch on it? What insights do you have there, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the $1 trillion question, and it lies the complexity of all of this. I have a situation and I'm so saddened that you all are suffering through this and have been for some time. The reality is that climate change and increasingly extreme weather events are going to put more and more pressure on the grid. It's not political. Just in the past year, we had both Texas and California's grids pushed to the brink. Texas, a very conservative state, California, a very progressive one. Texas, because at the time of extreme cold weather event, they're going through an extreme hot weather event right now. California, because of wildfires and extreme heat. It just goes to show you climate change doesn't care if you're a progressive or a conservative. And the grid is going to be continually tested in other regions of the country. It's coming. In the New England states, they have extreme winters. It's going to be a challenge. I think a lot of the challenges that some of the Western states are seeing in their resource mix are going to migrate east, and you're going to see some of those challenges emerge. And so how do we solve for that? How do we solve for the fact that, and it's a real conundrum, climate change is going to put more pressure on the grid, but the steps that we need to take to decarbonize currently are compromising reliability. So how can we move forward and deal with the reality of climate change while simultaneously maintaining not just reliability, but affordability? And this is where I keep coming back to a price on carbon. I just think that the alternatives are all untenable. Ignoring the problem is completely untenable. I think market-based solutions work because they're consumer-driven, and you can focus on reliability, and you can focus on affordability, and you can make these decisions in a clear way. Look, I'm a conservative. I loathe taxes. I loathe things that increase the price of energy. Yeah. So if we have carbon, I'm going to do what I can, if I'm a business owner, to do whatever I can to avoid paying that tax. And I think that's a pretty elegant solution that can enable us to deal with this complexity. And I do think, sadly, it sometimes takes really disastrous events to awaken people to the realities of the situations they're facing. Look, it's hard right now at a time when Americans are really suffering and feeling inflationary pressure, which is really being driven by energy costs. It's hard to talk about, increasing the cost of energy in that environment. But when you look at a price on carbon and compare it to some of the alternatives, a price on carbon economically starts to look pretty attractive. And it enables us to really, thread this needle of ensuring that our grid is in a position to withstand these increasing extreme weather events without sacrificing reliability and affordability.
Yeah, that is just great, Neil. Thank you very much. I'm going to give you one more question, and then you've given us so much information here, and I think that we ought to have those participating today have an opportunity to ask their questions. And Josh has just asked people I see to put questions in the chat, and then he'll be able to facilitate and moderate that. But kind of, you've touched on this all the way along, but we're just, and when did energy become so political? I mean, you explained this. I mean, it's just frustrating that it's become so political. But we ought to just be looking for good common sense policies that both sides of the aisle can agree on for the betterment of the environment, for the betterment of humanity, for the betterment of the citizens. And that's what we ought to be able to do. And we ought to keep our energy costs reliable and as affordable as possible. Clearly, you've said that. So let's try to be optimistic here and to talk about leadership opportunities. I mean, do you see breakthroughs in the energy space in the Congress, and any tips that you could give us here in the state of Utah? Are, some want us to move a lot faster. We're a super red state legislature, as you know. Some want us to move faster. A lot of us like the market-based approaches that you have. We're trying to find a good balance. Our renewable portfolio in the state is growing rapidly. Even though we can't get too much access to our federal lands where a lot of these opportunities would be for utility scale solar. But anyway, Neil, can you talk about that, kind of end on the leadership perspective, the lack of leadership perspective?
Yeah, look, I think everyone is culpable in this, in allowing this to become politicized. I actually get really frustrated because there's still this sort of antiquated notion that if you're for clean energy, the political left, and if you're for fossil fuels, if you're the political right. And I just think that is a totally outdated, outmoded way of thinking. But we have to work through that, and there's a couple of different ways that I think things are changing. One, when I was at FERC, I talked to the investment community a great deal. I talked to Wall Street, to private equity funds, to hedge funds, to big investors, and they have all made a huge collective bet on clean energy. And what I had these financiers of is I said, look, you guys are the ones that are backing the campaigns for Republican officials at state and federal level. You need to tell them that you are invested in the clean energy transition and help us overcome this idea that clean energy is something of the political left. On the other hand, look, I think the political left has played a role in this that I found frustrating to some degree. I've got a good friend of mine, Carlos Curbelo. He's a former congressman, Republican congressman from Florida. He was the primary author of a carbon mitigation bill in the U.S. House of Representatives. He had a tough election in 2018, and he was defeated, but all of the environmental groups came out for his opponent because of his position on the Affordable Care Act. And it's just maddening to me that if you're not willing to support the one Republican who's out there leading on these issues, how can you expect other Republicans to jump in, because they're never going to trust that you'll support them, because you're always going to be able to find someone more progressive. And that leads to this right now, where for some reason, climate change and carbon mitigation, something we should all agree we need to tackle together, has become politicized. And so I think both sides are culpable, and we need to work towards it. But I'm encouraged, actually. I am an optimist. And I think a lot of leadership in this area we're already seeing is coming from your state. It's coming from Utah. We've talked a great deal about Senator Romney and his leadership on these areas. Congressman Representative Curtis has been amazing. Yeah. He was episode 4, actually, of the Plugged In podcast at the Washington Examiner, if you guys want to check it out. But he has been a real leader in this space. And I actually think it's instructive that Kevin McCarthy, the House Republican leader in the U.S. House of Representatives right now, empowered Congressman Curtis and others to put forward a platform of issues that Republicans would champion if they take the majority in this November's election in 2023. And I do think that, in all likelihood, barring something completely unforeseen, Republicans will take the majority in the House of Representatives going into 2023. And it is very encouraging to me that we're seeing that. I'm sure there are some who will say they don't go nearly far enough, or they don't make enough specifics. I disregard that kind of talk. In my view, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, there was no way Republican leadership in either caucus of the House or Senate would have allowed this kind of proposal to go forward. And so I do think, I am optimistic about solutions moving forward. I also think technology is going to drive a lot of this. A lot of the concerns we have right now about, say, the intermittency of renewables, it's not there yet, but I believe it's coming. I believe we will get that breakthrough in long duration storage. We get long duration storage coupled with, solar and wind and other renewable sources of energy. We get a breakthrough in hydrogen. And suddenly, technology can drive a lot of this. This is why I'm not a big fan of some of these targets that get put out there. President Biden's out there, by 2035, we need to be here. In 2050, we need to be there. That cap and trade bill that Congress proposed in the late 2000s, the EPA Clean Power Plan, the projected emissions reductions in that legislation that never went anywhere, and in that regulation that never went anywhere, we've blasted through those emissions targets without regulation or legislative change, but because technology and innovation and consumer demand and market forces have driven all that. So I'm an optimist. I think that the combination of market forces, technological innovation, consumer demand will get us to a good place, and that our political leaders are going to get there as well. I think what it will take is both parties kind of holding their flanks at bay. On the one side, while I think they're getting fewer and fewer and fewer, there are still some folks on the Republican side who don't think we need to do anything about climate change. And on the left, there's people who think we need to move away from fossil fuels tomorrow. And neither one of those are responsible positions. But I think the overwhelming majority of our elected leaders, could probably get around some rational solutions that for the political right, yes, we are going to have to transition and move away from how we've been doing things conventionally in recognition of the challenges we're facing from climate change. But for the political left, they're going to have to accept that incremental progress is still progress and that we all need to work together. And I, for one, am optimistic that, if we have divided government from 23 to 25, I've been in Congress when we've had divided government. One example of something I concretely worked on when I was an aide to Senator McConnell is we coupled a lifting of the 40-year-old crude oil export ban in the U.S. with an extension of the tax credits for wind and solar. Those are the types of agreements that can come together when you have divided government. When you have one party control, if Democrats are in control, they don't want to lift the crude oil export ban. They just want to focus on the green energy credits. If Republicans are in control, they just want to lift the crude oil export ban. They don't want to do anything about the green credits. In divided government, you can actually get constructive solutions. And one area in which the Climate Leadership Council has really been leading is in the trade space and in this idea around a border carbon adjustment to leverage America's carbon advantage over, some pretty adversarial countries like Russia and Venezuela and China. I think there's, a real opportunity to generate considerable bipartisan support in that arena. And this is a space I'm going to keep very close tabs on from 23 to 25, because I'm optimistic that we can make some progress.
Neil, it has been so fun to talk to you, and I just love the way that you're talking, and I'd love to talk to you sometime another time offline. We certainly have that. You described that in the Utah legislature, those on the right who, and those on the left, and that's not reality. We have got to get to the middle and get these things done because our constituents are demanding it, and they want to continue to have, obviously every human does, affordable, reliable energy options and choices. And the market will do that, as you have said, a lot quicker than government mandates will allow that to happen. So I'm going to toss the time to Josh. There are 40 plus people in the conversation, and I'm going to toss it to you, Josh, and you can start teeing it up for some Q&A for Neil. How's that sound, Josh?
Sounds perfect. Thank you, Representative Handy. Thank you, Neil. That was fascinating. Before I get to our questions, I did want to say that I have put the link to Neil's bio and the Achieving Grid Reliability Through Decarbonization in the chat. We can share that around so you can take a look. It is indeed quite readable and a great introduction to some of these issues. So please do check that out. That's a great resource. I am going to take, Neil, one more sort of prerogative here as a moderator, just to sort of put an underline under our congressional delegation. We had folks, Representative John Curtis found the Conservative Climate Caucus, and then Representative Blake Moore, Representative Chris Stewart, and Representative Burgess Owens are all members. And I think that there are over 70 members of the House right now. But just thinking locally for us, we know there's been some hesitancy around carbon pricing. And we want to, engage and reward our congressional delegation for, speaking out on this. And I think representing where the broad middle of Utahns are. I don't know, just a quick comment on that about how do we give folks their due for stepping forward and being leaders and indeed in what is often a divisive issue around climate.
Yeah, no, it's a couple of fold. One is, the obvious, just, supporting folks who are taking positions. But here's one thing I want to be very careful on how I phrase this. I don't want to make it seem like we're rewarding people for bravery, because I don't like that. I don't want to make it seem like you have to be brave to come and step out on carbon mitigation. Reward them for being smart, reward them for being forward thinking, rewarding them for their leadership, I think is really important. But here's another thing that I think is really, really important. It's something that I directly tried to work on when I was at FERC. So I mentioned in the onset, I'm from Kentucky. And one of the challenges that, I face as a Kentuckian is there is this sort of perception that in Kentucky we're addicted to coal-fired generation and that we're just a bunch of hicks smoking our cigarettes, leaning against coal stacks. And so I purposely hosted a conference in my hometown of Lexington, Kentucky, which is not easy to get to. But I invited all of these leaders from the clean energy space to come to Kentucky, to come to this conference, because what I wanted them to see, and I wanted them to fly into Lexington and see that it's gorgeous. It's horse-brown country. It's it's bourbon country. Some of the most beautiful landscape you'll see in America. And I wanted these leaders in the clean energy space to see that, Kentuckians care about the quality of our land and the quality of our water and the quality of our air. And that, we're not clinging to coal-fired generation, out of some kind of, political bent. It's because it's been a source of jobs and revenues and inexpensive electricity that has enabled our economy to grow. And a lot of folks in the clean energy space haven't considered Kentucky because of these, kind of pre-existing biases. And what we have found in recent years is you've had some companies come into Kentucky. Amazon, for instance, has gone into coal country, the heart of coal country, and has opened some businesses and created some hope for economic prosperity in communities that have been ravaged by the decline of coal. And suddenly you've got folks in the heart of coal country where Amazon has really ambitious clean energy targets saying, hey, if this is good for Amazon and Amazon's good for my community, I'm good with it. And they're changing hearts and minds. And I think the same thing could apply in Utah. It's not just about rewarding your political leaders for taking a stand. Help attract some of the businesses that are leaders in this space to come to Utah. This is what I've told a lot of folks, in the clean energy space. I asked Tesla, for instance, they cited this huge gigafactory in Nevada. And I said, well, did you consider Eastern Kentucky, where we've got a workforce that is, has a history of working in the energy industry, and the same forklift that moves coal can move component parts for batteries? And they said, look, Kentucky didn't even approach us. Nevada pursued us. And so it's incumbent upon folks on all sides. I think leaders in Utah need to do what they can to draw clean energy companies into Utah, and make it a hospitable environment. And that will only further empower your legislative leaders to take these positions.
Yeah, I think that's great. And for those of you who aren't familiar with some of the work the state and the Carbon and Emery counties have done as part of their transition, that's where a lot of our coal plants are. There's the San Rafael Energy Center that they've done some investment in, and it's not easy work, but it's work that's important as we're thinking through. We can all talk through, regardless of whatever our label is behind our name, about that. I will ask. With that said, I want to let some folks ask their own questions. We'll start with Aaron Massover. Aaron, I'll let you unmute yourself and ask your question about carbon pricing.
Sure. Yeah. I just wanted to ask. Currently, gas prices are pretty high, and I wanted to ask: has that kind of affected? Have you perceived that people are less receptive to talking about carbon pricing? Has that really come up in any of your discussions?
Yeah, look, quite frankly, it's always difficult to talk about anything that's going to increase the price of energy. There's almost never a good time for it. When energy prices are high, people are scared to potentially layer any additional costs onto their energy. When energy prices are low, and the economy is thriving because energy is essential to economic growth, people don't want to disrupt that and increase the price of energy. Where I think we have to, focus the discussion is on, what are the alternatives? Carbon pricing, in my view, as a market-based solution, is far more effective than the alternatives. And when you start to dig into the costs of regulations or mandates or subsidies or inaction, then a price on carbon in that context makes a lot of sense. And so, yeah, of course, it's very difficult anytime you're talking about increasing prices on energy, whether energy prices are low or they're high. That shouldn't be a discussion in a vacuum. It's if we do nothing and extreme weather events continue to happen and climate change continues to ravage communities, that has huge, huge costs. But if we pursue a command and control regulatory approach or a heavily subsidized approach to try and have out of market forces drive market changes. Those are extremely costly as well. And I think once those costs are exposed, a price on carbon starts to look pretty attractive.
Very good. Thanks, Neil. James Griffith has, I think, a good question and a bit of but a good one for a former FERC chair. James, I'll let you unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, thanks for that. James Griffith here. Neil, I just had a quick question for you. Obviously, we've talked a lot about transmission and how that's an absolutely critical component of the electrification of the grid. I was just wondering what your thoughts were a little bit more specifically on the current NOPR that exists that FERC has put out as accepting comments on right now, particularly as it pertains to the huge, over 1 terawatt of interconnection backlog that exists, and what your thoughts are specifically within the NOPR as it pertains to the interconnection issues, and what maybe some of the more pressing or powerful steps FERC can take to reduce that backlog.
Yeah, no, fantastic question. I really want to applaud my former colleagues for the steps they're taking in this regard. Quite frankly, I had wanted to tackle transmission during my tenure at the commission, but it's one of those things that it's so all-encompassing. It would have required so much bandwidth. I would have had to sacrifice some of my other priorities, like 2222 and the battery storage rule and the carbon pricing policy statement that we finalized. And so I looked at more targeted fixes for transmission. But in many ways, I kind of cleared the decks to free up the current chairman, my friend Rich Glick, to really tackle this. And you nailed it. We can make all the investments and push capacity payments towards cleaner energy sources and do whatever we can to stimulate the deployment of cleaner energy sources. If they can't get interconnected, it's all for naught. And I think, getting through that Gordian knot and solving the challenges with the queue and moving towards queue reform, it's not going to be easy. And I think that the NOPR was an excellent step forward. And the fact that it was 5-0 shows that it was technical and not political. I think transmission writ large is technical and not political. And so I'm very, very encouraged by it. I think similarly, the planning NOPR, which was the first part of this, was also a significant step forward. There was one piece of it I didn't care for. I'm a big believer in competition. I think competition drives cost discipline and stimulates innovation. The commission seemed to take a step backwards on competition, but largely the rulemaking was solid. The biggest piece, and the representative hit on this, is still cost allocation, figuring out who pays. But if FERC can really take some meaningful bipartisan steps forward to get these things right, to get some equitable distribution of cost allocation, to get the interconnection queue issues right, to get interregional planning right, it could take huge steps towards us enabling that grid of the future. Here's the caveat, and it's going to be a challenge, and it's interesting, and I was screaming this from the rooftop during the end of my tenure at FERC. You cannot, historically, the proponents of transmission infrastructure build out to get clean energy to market have been the opponents of pipeline infrastructure. And I was saying, you cannot tie pipeline certificate approvals up in bureaucratic red tape on the Natural Gas Act side and not expect that same application would apply on the Federal Power Act side to transmission. And what I think is going to happen now is opponents of transmission are going to use those proponents' anti-pipeline playbook against them. And it is a challenge to get siting done when it comes to transmission. And people are going to fight siting transmission lines every bit as hard as they fight siting pipelines. And so I think FERC could get all of these policies right. It's ultimately going to come down to not really even just the state level, the local level. People in local communities are going to have to figure out how to navigate the complexity of building out this necessary transmission.
Very good answer. I think last question. Jared Strebel has a question about buildings, and I'm going to, because this involves the state legislature, Jared, I'm going to just ask a version of this myself. To ask for Neil, I don't know, you're a conservative, believe in market-based solutions. I was just thinking through, just quickly, are there places like transmission and others where a carbon price or traditional market tools may fall a bit short? Where are some areas where we should be, we can work together across party lines on maybe investment or regulatory tools in a couple of sectors where maybe hard to squeeze out some of those emissions reductions?
I mean, that's a really complicated question. I think,
I know it's a big question. Yeah.
When we're talking about price on carbon, we're talking about, kind of market-based solutions in the power sector writ large, or if we have an economy-wide price on carbon. But there are other things we can do. And I think certainly, we've talked about expanding electrification, building electrification and the like. We've just got to make sure that the grid can handle it. And I think increasingly one of the positive things is we're having more and more conversations. I was a bit alarmed, maybe a half decade or more ago, that there was this big push to electrify the vehicle fleet, but there wasn't a lot of communication between the automotive sector and the power sector because, and I was nervous that we would find ourselves in a scenario in which you would all of a sudden have this surge in demand from expanded vehicle electrification, and the power sector might not have been in a place to handle that surge in demand. You're going to have to factor in similar things when it comes to building electrification. I don't know as much about building electrification. I have been focused on vehicle electrification. And this is, again, another area where public policy outside of a price on carbon is going to be essential here. How do we make sure we deal with range anxiety? How do we make sure in a state like Utah that you have enough charging infrastructure in place so that folks feel comfortable, not just getting an electric vehicle to drive in their local community in Salt Lake or Provo, but if you want to drive across the West, you want to know that you've got a footprint in place where you can charge your vehicle and get to your destination and overcome that range anxiety. And that's going to take working with utilities, working with existing petroleum retailers, finding ways to cooperate and coordinate to get that kind of planning right. And so, yeah, that's just one narrow example of how we can make progress in energy policy, both at the micro and at the macro level.
That's a great answer. Thank you. And it was a bit broad, but I appreciate that it's a place where we want to work together with a lot of our existing stakeholders. We have a big state, so but energy states, we have a lot of great minds that can work there. I just want to, and
for you all, Representative mentioned it. Do you guys have community solar in Utah? I didn't think Utah was a community solar state, but it sounded like you had some kind of community energy legislation go through.
No, we don't have community solar, Neil.
Okay.
We have the Rocky Mountain Power has something called what's it called, Josh?
The Community Renewable Energy Act.
Yes, the Community Renewable Energy Act, but we don't have community solar.
Oh, we have a subscriber solar program. There
is
a
subscriber solar. Yeah, Rocky has, but it's not really true community solar, and the Energy Committee is going to study that in August, by the way, as you know.
We are in the process of Representative Handy authored this bill that is looking at, it gives communities, while remaining part of their investor-owned utility, and the option to look through expanding the amount of renewable energy that they have by 2030. Okay. And it's a pretty innovative and unique thing, and the communities and Rocky Mountain Power are still negotiating before they go to the Public Service Commission about how that rate design can work. It's sort of like a community choice aggregation arrangement, to geek out a little bit, except the utility gets to own the resources, the maintain the resource mix. So it doesn't change how resources are procured, but it's an interesting mix. So anyway, that's we'd love to send you a little bit more about that. Maybe one way in which Utah is doing some interesting experiments about our future. Neil, before we close, I want to thank you. And if you have any parting thoughts, for what you're welcome to share, but we can also wrap things up.
No, I just love it. I think, again, Utah and Kentucky are so vastly different in terms of the physical landscape, but I think there's a lot of cultural similarities. And again, I love the leadership that you guys are showing, that your elected leaders are showing, in this area. I love the fact that, folks in Utah care about their environment and want, clean, reliable, affordable energy. And I applaud you all for this. Thank you so much for this opportunity today.
Neil, thank you for joining. Representative Handy, thank you for being our moderator today. And thank everyone here for participating. Look out for more later this summer from the Climate Clean Air Compact. and keep up the good work. I'll let everyone